I began with the hanging pods since I knew they would take a lot of time between construction of the underlying forms and then covering them over with sculpted felt. I wanted to have a variety of squishinesses in the overall forms, as well as surface details. I started off with plans for 21 hanging pods that I had to narrow down to 12 to fit the space at the museum, which was also good for my sanity. I chose the ones that were most intriguing and varied, and I figured out which approach to use to make them. In all cases, a coating of white wool batting, shaped and smoothed with felting needles, would be the finished surface, but I used different approaches to bulk up what was underneath. In general, I had to either stitch a pattern and fill it to create an armature, or else carve down or build up the base material. I'll show examples of each. First, the one called Curvy Plains is an example of a stitched, stuffed piece in which I made a very small paper model and then enlarged it to make the full-size pattern and had it printed out on 36-inch wide paper. I used my light table to trace and cut out the pattern in freezer paper, which is waxed on one side. I rolled out my industrial felt. This tan stuff is called Eco Felt, and it's from Sutherland Felt, and arranged the pieces efficiently. I used freezer paper because you can iron it on, melting the wax slightly to hold it in place while you cut it out. The felt I'm using is 3/8 of an inch thick, so I use a large rotary cutter, and I have to use fresh blades quite often because the felt really dulls them. I label the pieces so I can reassemble them correctly, and here it doesn't matter that I've written right on the pattern because it will ultimately be covered by white wool. To stitch the pieces together, I used thick waxed linen thread. It had to be done by hand because there is no machine, at least that I could find, that could handle material this thick and zigzag wide enough to really make a bite that would hold in the felt. Since felt is a non-woven textile, if I stitched too close to the edge, the thread could just pull out. I had to experiment to figure out what stitch length and spacing to use, but that's part of why I did these hanging pods first. My learning curve could be hidden and I'd have it figured out by the time I got to the holdable pieces where the stitching would be visible. You see me wearing gardening gloves as I stitch as well. That's to protect my fingers, which get really beaten up by pulling the thread tight repeatedly. When I was nearly done stitching this piece, I left one whole side open and filled it with foam rubber blocks attached to a cable and metal disc. I'll show you that shortly. And then fill the rest of the void with fiberfill. Here's the form at the end of the stitching phase. Here are some of the volunteers who helped me cover this with white wool and shape the surface, adding detail and smoothness. I'll talk more about that soon. And here's the finished piece. The next example is from a piece originally called Stacked Globes, but people kept telling me it looked like a larva or a caterpillar or a grub, and that name stuck. Grub is an example of a complex pattern that I had to figure out by making a three-dimensional model first. For that, I carved styrofoam so I'd be able to shape it easily and quickly, and then pin fabric directly onto it as I worked out the pattern. I used a hot wire cutter to carve it, gradually removing the material I didn't want to reveal the form. Carving styrofoam with hot wire tools is very satisfying and also very slow, since you can't drag the wire through any faster than it can melt the styrofoam. It's also very toxic to breathe in the vaporized styrofoam, so I used a respirator and worked in a plasticed off area with a window and a fan whenever I couldn't work outdoors. I sanded the styrofoam in another plastic walled area in my studio because otherwise those bits get everywhere. Actually, they still get everywhere, but I kept a dedicated shop vac in the space to clean myself after each session, and I was left with a nice form to work with. To create the actual pattern, I pinned pieces of thin felt over the model and smoothed it down. Wherever the felt rippled or buckled, I trimmed it away. Then I moved on to the next piece. I made the pattern for only half of the model since it was to be symmetrical, and I labeled all the pieces well so I could put them back together. I took them all off the styrofoam, traced them, scanned them into my computer, smoothed them out digitally, scaled them up, and had them printed at full size. My studio assistants helped me cut out and label all 36 pattern pieces. Yes, there do exist computer programs that could probably do most of that, but I wanted to teach myself how to translate between 2D and 3D by hand and really understand it. I didn't want the over-perfection of a digitized shape, and I didn't want to spend my time in front of the computer. That's just how I'm wired, and I'm totally fine with it. When I was done stitching and stuffing, I had helpers to coat the entire form with a thick layer of wool batting. Eventually, I started adding on the sculpted detail of the rolls in between those main bulges. You can see that this piece looks really roughed out and fuzzy at this stage. Lots of needle poking later, it's getting smoother and more defined. So I've been shaping these kind of folds of flesh to make them look a little bit more believable, so that there's more weight at the bottom and it looks as though the kind of globe parts of these sort of squish together. Even though this is, clearly a made-up form, it's based loosely on real life, and I like to take advantage of things like physics and gravity and try to make it look like these have a place in the world with us. So because this piece is sort of hunched over, again, it's got kind of these smoother, flatter areas in the back, and then they come to more of a thicker point up here. And there's a lot more wool pushed in on this side. On this back side, it's a little bit more firm. So I've built up more felt here so it's squishier, and you can kind of get your fingers in there and feel the folds. The whole point of this project is to get people to actually encounter something new and be encouraged to touch it and to learn through touch and to connect with where they are in this moment in time and the other people who are experiencing it together. So I'm trying to make a really tantalizing surfaces and shapes that people will want to touch. And here's the finished piece. You may have noticed by now that my artwork titles are really just descriptions, so you won't be surprised that this piece is called Veiny Bulb. It has some unusual surface detailing, but it's also a great example of how I carved foam rubber for the underlying form, giving this piece a very squishy feel when you hug it. I used an electric turkey carving knife to cut out foam rubber for this piece, and as you'll see, this is also an opportunity to note that I had helpers on this project from all parts of my life, including my offspring. This footage is from a day my son Alex was in the studio helping me. The foam rubber available was only about 6 inches thick, so I stacked up and glued rough slices of cutouts. Normally I use a tripod to film, but on this day I got some helpful feedback from my camera person. In this photo showing the glued together layers, you can see a cable sticking out of the stack on the right-hand side at its top. To suspend the hanging pods, I embedded or built around a cable with a metal plate inside towards the bottom. It's meant to support and distribute the weight. The hanging pods weigh between 12 and 40 pounds, and that's not counting people leaning on them to hug. You can see in this drawing how, for the previous 2 types of stitched skin construction, I filled the vertical space between the metal disc and the top with blocks of foam rubber, then stuffed filler around it. In this Veiny Bulb piece and another similar carved foam rubber one, I simply cut a channel through the core. Later, I covered the exposed cable up at the top by wet felting over it. Again, the electric turkey knife worked well to shape this into a bulb form in the round, and then it was a matter of covering the whole thing with wool, which gets embedded into the foam rubber when you poke into it. I had a lot of help for this stage. And then it was time to apply the dark brown wool for the veins with help from my studio assistant, and then to cover them over so they would be both dimensional and a bit darker than the surrounding areas. And here's the finished piece. The final hanging pod process I want to present is Boxy. This one has hard planes and angles with more pliable areas between them, as if someone crammed blocks into a nylon stocking. To construct this one, I glued styrofoam blocks together around my cable and disc using expanding foam, and simply started felting over them, filling in some of the spaces between, but keeping an eye to the logic of how the skin would flow and stretch over and between the different blocks. As you now know, needle felting works by compressing the fibers in the direction you're poking. So for this piece, it was a matter of working on these different flat areas from each direction, and then also building up the bridges between. Yes, it takes a long time. Yes, I do spend a lot of hours alone in my studio poking at wool. But this was a group effort. So many hands worked on this piece alone over the course of many months. This process is indicative of how it went for all of the 12 hanging pods. First, the wool was added over the whole surface and built up more where it was needed for shape or detail. Then the surface was laboriously evened out and smoothed, all through repetitive poking with felting needles. Thousands of hours went into the making of these interactive sculptures, and it simply would not have been possible without the volunteers and studio assistants who helped me. First, I'll show you how Boxy ended up, and then I want to talk about all those helpers. I honestly don't remember when or how the idea of bringing in helpers first occurred to me, or if someone else suggested it. I'm guessing it was pretty early on, since I don't know how I ever would have expected to complete the work on time otherwise. The scale and quantity of sculptures that made up the 12 hanging pods were far more ambitious than anything I had attempted before. I started looking for a studio assistant to regularly help me during the week, and found Jordan, an art student at Santa Clara University who brought a lot of enthusiasm for the wide variety of weird things I needed her to do. Here, we ground up scraps of foam into small, usable pieces for stuffing, using a string trimmer in a garbage can, as one does. Another occasional studio assistant, Jessica, helped get the forms underway and ready for coating with wool. Stuffing and stitching the hanging pods closed was sometimes a 3-person job. I put the word out at the Open Studios event I held in May 2018 that I was looking for people who'd want to join me in my studio poking at wool sculpture for a big project, and I got a great response. My idea was that I'd put some felting party dates on the calendar and let people know, set up a studio, do some training, walk around felting and checking in on people's work, and provide some snacks. I figured any extra hands on deck would be a benefit, and the only real risk was trying to make sure people didn't poke themselves. I didn't anticipate how much I'd also enjoy having the energy, conversations, and insights of people of all ages, from all walks of life and levels of art-making experience. Some even had prior needle felting experience and could jump right in on details. Some volunteers came once, some came a few times, and some stuck with me through the whole 1.5 years of poking to come. Which is impressive because, frankly, what I asked them to do was repetitive, if satisfying. While I did a lot of the really fussy detail work during the week, my weekend volunteers mostly tackled the wide open expanses of wool, refining, smoothing, and tightening the surfaces so they could be touched a lot but would stay intact. Some helpers preferred to work on particular hanging pods due to their shape or the particular sensations of poking into the underlying armature materials of industrial felt, foam rubber, or styrofoam, which all react and sound a little different when you poke into them. And I didn't just direct helpers on how to copy models. There was still some decision-making to do along the way, and a real interchange of ideas and suggestions. Needle felting is such a slow and gradual process that I had no worries about pieces dramatically going in the wrong direction. There was plenty of opportunity for course correction, and I think that was reassuring to everyone. After Jordan went back to school, I welcomed another regular studio assistant, Mercer, a recent studio art graduate who joined me for the picky final felt finishes. This piece, Orb Cluster, was one of the first that I started and the last finished, thanks to all the individual pillow blobs that had to be hand-stitched on in graduating size. I was very glad to have assistance with certain pieces in particular. Besides hanging pods, Mercer helped me with hand-stitching and problem-solving when it came to the next stage, making holdables. And she helped provide creative interpretations of the works in progress. Volunteers and studio assistants were crucial to the creation of the hanging pods. And here they are, finished. Besides feeling proud of them as sculptural objects, when I look at them, I'm also reminded of the way my creative community turned out to be wider and deeper than I ever thought. I asked for help, and 76 people stepped up to do so, many of whom I'd never met before, and many of whom have since become dear friends. One more question you may have about the hanging pods. What do they hang from? Originally, I envisioned them literally hanging from the ceiling of the venue via bolts or a hanging grid. The reality of the actual ceiling at the Saisset Museum prevented that from being a possibility. My thoughts turned to a framework of some kind, something simple that would support the work and not distract from it. I wanted the hanging pods to be spaced out so that visitors would have room to move between and around them, yet at the same time, I wanted to encourage a closer encounter than what is generally welcomed in a museum. Early on, I set up some stand-ins in my studio to pace out how it would feel to move among them. I also got some feedback from studio neighbors and arrived at roughly 3 feet of space between the pods as a good distance. I made some sketches, and an artist friend connected me with Chuck Splady from Splady Art Studios in Oakland to make it into a reality. Chuck and his team designed a simple, elegant, easy to put together and disassemble set of 2 steel structures that would easily hold the weight of the hanging pods and then some. He also invited me to bring my husband and sons up to the studio to see and try out some metalworking techniques. I think my kids found it a little more exciting than needle felting. The finished result of the steel structure is just what I wanted, and I think it adds to the work, providing an angular, industrial contrast to the organic pod forms.